I'm George Cheedy here at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and on this episode of The Next Atlanta, we're discussing the personal experiences of Black people in our city. But first, you may have noticed something a little different about me. I had my own run-in with violence on the street between tapings of this episode, but that story is just one of many that needs to be told today. See, if we're ever going to see meaningful change, we have to talk about it. More importantly, we have to listen. So we're speaking to a sheriff's deputy and someone who's experienced homelessness. Both want a real dialogue between cops and the communities they police. Then we're sitting with Dr. Vicki Crawford, director of the King Collection at Morehouse, to talk about nonviolence and the historic perspective of civil rights leaders in this country. Today, a mile in my shoes on The Next Atlanta. I'm George Cheedy, and we are at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. This is The Next Atlanta, and I am here with Officer Terrence Wortham of the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office. Tell us about yourself.
I've been in law enforcement for 21 years. During my tenure, I've served as a homicide detective. I've served as a undercover narcotics detective. I've served as a domestic violence detective. I've done fugitive. I've worked at the courthouse, and part of my current assignment is also as a SWAT operator.
One of the things I want to get at for the people who are watching this show is an understanding of trauma, that a lot of police work involves both experiencing trauma yourself and having to manage the trauma of others. Let's start with an example, one that might leap to mind for you, of a case, an incident, an arrest, a warrant service, something that you remember to be particularly traumatic.
Having done this for 21 years, you're right, I've seen quite a few trauma in my lifetime. One of the biggest things for me is having to go home and tell a loved one that a family member is not going to come home because they was just involved in an accident where there were fatalities. And trying to absorb that child's or that husband or that mother's pain and having to deliver that bad news, it's just something that you kind of take home with you every day.
Tell me how that affects you as an officer.
I mean, it does affect you. If you say that it don't as an officer, then I would say something is probably a little bit off with you. I don't think people are designed to take in that much trauma day in and day out without having some type of outlet to go to. And so I try not to let it affect me, but it does, and that's when you have to go to your outlet, whatever that may be.
What's your outlet?
My outlet is bowling.
I wouldn't have pegged you for a bowler. I don't know why. I used to bowl, so I'm bad at it. Do you have resources within your department if you're experiencing stress or difficulty with the trauma that you're experiencing?
Right. We do. We have a program called EAP, Employee Assistance Program. And it's a program that you can call up at any time. You don't have to have a supervisor to give you permission to do so. You don't have to discuss it with anyone. You just call them up at any time and say, hey, I need to come in for a conversation. And I have used them before, and I know many of my colleagues have.
Turning to the folks that you've had to interact with, somebody who may be having a family member arrested, okay, for example, like you're serving a warrant, you taking somebody in, and there's grief. Mm-hmm. What do you do to mitigate that?
I try and pull the family to the side, and I try and explain it to them in the most simplest form that I can, that this is why I'm here. Unfortunately, I have a paper in my hand that is signed by a judge that say I must act on this. And so I'm doing my job. In the process, I will answer any questions that they have. I will give them every reason to believe that what I'm telling them it's the absolute truth and they have no reason to believe otherwise. And you're gonna have those who, no matter what, they're just not gonna wanna hear what you have to say. And you have to deal with those people quarterly. But in the process, you just try and answer their questions. You say, hey, listen, this is what's going on. I know you don't agree with it. You may not understand it, but just understand I'm here to do my job. So please allow me to do that.
Are there other resources that you would want to bring to bear in order to mitigate these, interactions?
I can't think of any resources that I would want to bring, but I think that conversations need to be had. I think an understanding from both sides needs to be had. I think it's very important. I think a lot of the misconceptions that people have toward a police officer, if we have things or organizations or programs in place where people can come in and just hear from us and we hear from them, then they'll be able to take from that, okay, you know what, I misunderstood that. Or what I was told, that's not necessarily the case because I heard it firsthand. And I think that in itself will bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement. But both sides have to be willing to do it. Both sides have to have patience and understanding. And I think that's lacking on both sides of the spectrum.
Do you have a general perspective on what you're seeing out of the protests at this point?
I think it's a good thing because I think it brings about an immediate change that needs to happen. And I want to make sure I'm clear. I'm not confusing protesters with rioters. I think protesting is a good thing. Protesting has been in our history books for a long time. And I think that it's bringing about a change that people see needs to happen. So my perspective is, as long as you're peaceful, as long as you have an agenda and you're focusing on making people that can make policy change aware of what your agenda are, then I think that those people have no choice but to listen and say, okay, something needs to be done. Because if you got 3 people protesting, that's one thing. But if you got hundreds of thousands across the United States, then obviously it's a problem.
When we're talking about the perception of the public toward law enforcement right now, is there anything that you would want to tell people who are afraid of cops? Like, what do you tell somebody who's afraid of the police?
Being afraid of the police is, in my opinion, is just ridiculous, even with what has transpired. I get what the perception is, but the overall law enforcement person is just out to do the right thing. I think the biggest misconception is that when a regular man or woman goes to a police academy, he has now transformed into something that is no longer relatable to people. He no longer has feelings. He no longer hurts. He no longer have problems in his family. He no longer have any of those things. And that's simply not true. So I would tell people, when you see an officer, just say, hey, officer, how's your day going? How are you doing? Because we have family issues as well. We have delinquent kids. We have all the things that we have to go out and bring a resolution to each and every day. We have those things going on as well. So what we have to start asking ourselves is, how do we help the helper? And how we help the helper is just by asking them, how's your day? What do you have going on? Anything I can help you with? Anything you want to share? Anything you want to get off your chest? Something as simple as that would go a long way with a police officer, because it would tell us that, hey, my community cares about me just as much as I care about my community. So the misconception is that all officers are bad. And if you take that and you use it as a narrative, it's no different than a police officer saying all Black people are criminals. If you don't want the law enforcement officer to categorize one group of people, then why are you doing it to us?
Officer Wortham, I'm incredibly grateful for your time here. You've been very open with us, and that's what we need right now, I think.
Thank you.
I'm George Cheedy, and we are at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. This is The Next Atlanta, and I am with Tyrone West, who's a longtime resident of Atlanta. Tyrone, tell us about yourself.
I'm a previous homeless person. I've been in the streets. I've dealt with so much of disgrace, hopelessness. I've seen it all, George.
Tell me about a moment in your life when you've had an interaction with the police that you believe is emblematic of the problems that have people in the street right now.
Okay, one in particular, I can tell you a bunch of them, but I'll just pick one in particular. As we are living in a homeless shelter, we have to leave at a certain time. So being that we're on the streets, it's not like we have a community to go to or we can go to the library or anything like that. When they put us out of the shelters, we're on the streets. So then I get to interact with the police where they're telling me that I have to leave the streets, but I'm homeless. Where am I to go now? Where am I to go? Their only suggestion is either you leave from in front of me or you go to jail. I can't go back in the shelters because we can't go back into the shelters till at a certain time. They put us out in the morning. We can't come back until a certain time. So therefore, if we don't, most of us, we ride the trains and then you get in the interaction with the MARTA police. We ride the trains, but when they put us out of those shelters, it's nowhere to go. We'll come to the parks, then they by being in the parks, they destroy the parks because there's no place for them to use the bathrooms or anything like that. There's no place to take showers.
This is a trite question, but I gotta ask it. How does this make you feel?
It burns my heart. Not much for me, the women and children. They're also out in the streets. Women and children, they're not allowed to take showers. They can't go to Gateway and take a shower till a certain time. So they're just left out on the streets, and we're out here, and it's really bad.
There's a lot of talk about good cops and bad cops. Given what you've just said, is there a way you can distinguish one from another?
It's the interaction with the cop. When the first interaction with a cop, you can tell. As soon as he comes, because I've met cops that will come at you before they say anything. They have a suggestion of what we can do or where we can go. Like there's an organization, can I say it?
Yeah.
It's called PAD. It's pre-arrest diversion. That's the program I'm in right now.
Oh,
they gave me a situation before taking me, when they told me that I had to leave the streets, I was illegally camping. They said I was illegally camping. But the way we interacted, he said that we had a program called PAD that will get me off the streets. I took that program. That program is a great program.
I helped set up PAD.
Great.
The thing I really want to understand is, what do you think needs to change? What stops the negative interactions that you've seen? What would have to be in place?
Great question. They have just, I heard, hired 20 new police officers. Before those 20 new police officers should hit the streets, we as a community should be able to interview each and every one of those officers. Like I said, our first meet, I would know if you're a racist cop. And if we, the community, feel that you're a racist cop, then go to somewhere else. Go somewhere else. You could still be a cop. I'm not saying that you can't be a cop, but just go somewhere else. Because in our community, we're gonna need some compassion and feelings. And I can't be scared that when the cops come, I'm thinking that they're coming to kill me. My only thought, I don't want that. I don't want my kids, my grandchildren, or anybody to grow up thinking that they seeing a cop, that he's coming to kill them. We don't need that in our community now.
When you were homeless, how often did you interact with the police?
Every day.
Every day.
Every day. Some good, some bad. Some telling me I have to move, some telling me that, well, move for, just don't make it seem like you're placed as a home here, that you're laying here, staying here. Get up, move. Just don't be here when I come back.
How long did it take to get you to shelter? Like, how long had you been homeless before
I've been under the Prior Street Bridge last summer. I did the summer and the winter. Pad came in the wintertime.
How was it the first interaction with Pad that got you into the program?
Very first interaction with Pad got me into the program. Now there are homeless people that's asking me, how can they get into it? It's not a situation where you could just walk in. You understand, you set it up. It's the interaction with the police. So I tell them, I don't know. I say when you have an interaction with the police, don't be aggressive to them.
Yeah.
And maybe they will offer you a program. Don't, because a lot of times we're aggressive to the police. As soon as they come, we have an aggression towards them. If you speak nicely or politely, maybe they'll offer you that program like they offered it to me.
Is there a message that you would want to convey to the world? You're willing to protest in order to change the way policing works and change the world. Here's a chance. Like, take a second, tell people what you want to see happen.
What I would like to see happen, all over every community needs to interact with the police. As I say, if we could just do this, we can interact with the police before they hit the streets, so we can know them and they can know us. And that will help us all out.
All right. Tyrone West,
thank you.
ladies and gentlemen, I'm incredibly grateful. I'm so glad that you were here. I'm George Chidi, and this is The Next Atlanta. We're at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and I'm here with Dr. Vicki Crawford, a professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse College. Dr. Crawford, would you just first tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
I am currently the director of the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collection, and that is a collection of over 13,000 items belonging to Dr. King. Many of those items are handwritten. It includes his iconic sermons and speeches and correspondence with world leaders, and is just such a rich treasure trove for teaching and for learning. And also I work with the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is where we are now, in curating rotating thematic exhibits of the papers. We've had some exhibits on nonviolence, exhibits on Dr. King and youth, and various different themes over the past few years.
I had a run-in a few days ago with folks who were protesting in ways that I would describe as not nonviolent. And one of the things I want to get into is a sense of how people who were working in the civil rights movement with Dr. King trained, like the emphasis on nonviolence and why people protested in ways that were nonviolent.
So the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s obviously was a continuation of an ongoing struggle for freedom that begins decades earlier, certainly in the 1940s, 1930s, so that they had a rich history to draw upon. There was extensive training. For example, the Atlanta student movement, the Nashville student movement, college students who were very active in the movement would attend sessions led by, for example, in Nashville, James Lawson. James Lawson was one of the key people in this country who had studied nonviolence extensively, having been all over the world to study and to follow Gandhi. And he was one of the key people that brought the strategy and the philosophy of nonviolence violence to Dr. King. Dr. King in 1955, on the eve of the Montgomery bus boycott, was not always a strong proponent of nonviolent civil resistance. He had to come to that. So yes, there was extensive training. Hopefully in today's time, we still have organizations where people generationally are passing along a lot of this knowledge and the tactical and strategic kinds of training that you need for this kind of protest.
What are people taught in school these days about what King did and how King trained? What does the curriculum look like right now?
Well, we know the K through 12 curriculum needs more work in this area, as well as curricula in colleges and universities. The Southern Poverty Law Center did a study several years ago about civil rights education and sort of what is the state of the field. And what they discovered in that great report, and it was introduced by Julian Bond at the time, that civil rights education was lacking in terms of K through 12 education, that basically when we get to World War II in a history class or social studies, it sort of ends there. It drops off. Cold War maybe. But the civil rights teaching about social justice, that we need work in that area. We need to deepen that in our schools. And apart from what they call just the dominant narrative of Rosa Parks, one day she was tired, you know that narrative. She gave up her seat, and after that she sat down and a movement ensued, and Dr. King was made head of the movement in Montgomery, and from there else, the movement went through these different campaigns, and it was over by 68. So we're changing that, and there are educators all over the country, people working on this, in parts of the country where we are saying that, first of all, that trajectory is kind of wrong from 54, 55 to 68. As I said earlier, the movement goes back much farther than that. It begins earlier and extends farther on this way. So the periodization is now extended. Also, I think we need to find the lesser known stories, and we need to introduce young people to some of the people that are still lesser known. We've got people like, start calling it Amzie Moore in Mississippi, or Fannie Lou Hamer, everyday, quote, ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And what is the lesson learned there? The lesson learned is, you too can do that.
Are there lessons that people are in the street today, are there lessons that you think need to be heard again? Things that people may have missed that would improve outcomes right now?
I think what we need to have some multi-generational conversations. I don't know if there's space for that. I think what we're seeing right now in the streets is a tipping point. I mean, people have called it an inflection point. What's going on in America today? You've got a pandemic, this, really shoring up all the social inequalities, economic inequalities, and equities. You've got that happening. You've got, all of that is sort of framing, and this police, problem with police violence and gun violence. So what do they need to know? What is missing? We might need to have relationships. I mean, what might be missing is the work of organizations like the good old YMCA or social organizations, or filling in that gap, so that people have contact with others outside of their friend group. And churches, we can talk about all these churches. Is there a program for young people and working with them across these generational divides?
It's interesting that you bring up churches right now. A lot of what we're seeing is not led by religious authority, if you know what I mean. Like that, there's a sort of a general skepticism of authority of all kinds driving a lot of what I'm seeing. I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, well, we saw that in the 60s, for sure. I mean, that's what we saw largely. That's what, questioning authority, civil dissent based on questioning authority, that goes back to the 60s and even before. So that's not disturbing. I mean, I think the questions are great. I don't think therein lies the problem. I just think that there's got to be a space for having the conversation, because young people are seeing that's what this moment is showing up. there's systemic inequalities.
Is King's message that a riot is the language of the unheard, is that still enough to say this is, like, we should not accept violence, but we should understand it? Is that enough to say today?
He believed that violence was self-defeatist, that it was not something that could move people forward, but that it was self-defeatist, that it didn't really cure the problem. So, is that message heard today? There are many messengers today. Let me say something about Black Lives Matter and a lot of different organizations that are now that have been organized in this country. There are many messages, and there are many critiques of what happened in the 1960s. One thing we see with the organization of Black Lives Matter is different people are the leaders, okay? We've got women who are standing at the helm and leading. We have recognition of the LGBTQ community who are involved in organizing and mobilizing. We've got some remarkable things that are going on in today's time that were not there in King's day.
Dr. Crawford, I'm incredibly grateful for the time that you've been able to give us. This was helpful.
Well, thank you.
Today we've been talking about experience and how it shapes us. Now I want to talk about my own. I'm wearing this shiner because I was attacked while reporting on demonstrations after the shooting of Rayshard Brooks. As a warning, the video you're about to see is graphic and we've blurred some faces. There were many people protesting peacefully at the scene of Brooks' death, but also some who weren't. I was beaten by a group that falsely accused me of taking their picture. I didn't fight back. When I started my career in journalism as an Army combat correspondent 25 years ago, I learned how to deal with violence. This isn't the first time I've been punched for asking questions, but it was traumatic. And like the experiences of my guests today, it's something that has the power to inform my perspective. Right now, many of us expect police to be held accountable. We expect citizens not to break the law. We expect protesters not to assault the journalists telling their stories. But the world we wish we lived in and the world we do live in are the same. There is injustice, and people are angry. The quest for equality is called a fight for a reason. But before we throw punches, let's try to listen to each other, even if we don't agree. Maybe we could start a meaningful conversation. If you think it's unfair to jail people just for being poor, and you want to help those experiencing poverty with resources and community-driven alternatives to incarceration, visit atlantapad.org. That's atlantapad.org. Next week, on the next Atlanta, Jail and Monuments. We take a look at what should be left standing and what might be a relic of the past. Next Sunday, on the next Atlanta.